Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. As you may know, I have done videos on Franz Kafka's The Castle and on Amerika, so naturally I wanted to make one also on The Trial. Let me show you my German copy, which I have not read, of course, but this is closer to the original, so I just felt the need to show you this. So here's the thing, I was waiting for the right moment, okay, and it has come because, as you may know, this novel is turning 100 this year, if we go, of course, by date of publication. I first read it in the year 2012, so a reread was urgent for me, really. This is, as you know, Kafka's most famous of his novels, and many people have, of course, called it prophetic. Let me share with you my experience with this text and also rereading it right now. So, like much of Kafka's work, The Trial was published posthumously in the year, of course, 1925. And as you know, Kafka had instructed his friend Max Brod to destroy, basically, all of his works. Now, from Brod himself, we know that he had told Kafka very clearly that he was not going to carry out his instructions. So Kafka was well aware of that. If we read the diaries of Franz Kafka, we learn that he was working on this novel, The Trial, in the year 1914, also 1915, and as a matter of fact, having quite a difficult time with it, as he did with many of the texts that he published. Like much of his work, this novel, The Trial, is unfinished. But really, due to the nature of the work of Franz Kafka, the way that he produced his writings, what we have here is more than enough. You know how it is with Kafka. Even if you look at the texts that are supposedly finished and complete, there's a certain open quality to them. So that's one of the reasons why we can read unfinished Kafka and still enjoy it and not get that feeling of uncertainty or inconclusiveness or anything like that. With authors who have a more plot-driven approach, you may read their unfinished works and be like, okay, I'll read everything that they published, even if they come up with a collection of their shopping lists or something. But in the case of Kafka, you can read it and actually, in many cases, not even be able to tell that the work is technically unfinished. The Trial is 230 pages long. We have 10 chapters here. And the story begins when an ordinary man named Joseph K., he's a bank clerk, receives the news that he is under arrest. So just like in the Metamorphosis, we have here the experience of a man dealing with the unexpected, dealing with a disruption of order in his own home. Now there's a difference here because, interestingly, in the case of Joseph K., his life does not really change outwardly. Let's put it that way. So he is able to and allowed to carry out his activities, to do everything as he had been doing it before, even to go to work and all of that kind of stuff. But the big difference is here the knowledge, right? His knowledge that he is under arrest and that he apparently is going to have to go through a trial. Here's the rub. Joseph K. does not really know what he is guilty of. His warders, the people who are looking at him in his own home, do not even know either. And he doesn't even know who is accusing him in the first place. So for the rest of the novel, and this is what happens really in The Trial, he is going to meet a series of characters as he tries to figure out what it is that he is guilty of, what is happening, and to also, in a way, clear his name. Strictly speaking, there is no plot to The Trial. Okay, so you have one of the chapters, for example, that clearly tells you at the end this chapter is unfinished, but it seems that it doesn't really matter. To this novel you could add things, you could also erase passages from it. We'll actually have passages that Kafka deleted, and they are included, at least in this edition that I have. As tends to be the case, really, Kafka focuses on a situation that is presented and re-examined. In this case, the fact that this man is under arrest for a reason that he doesn't understand. So because of that, because of the presentation and re-examination of a situation, I said in a previous video that my advice to Kafka would have been, hey Franz, why don't you write novellas? Why don't you go for a novella instead of a novel? Very, presumptuous on my part, but that's what I would have said. The secondary characters in this novel are interesting enough to me. One of the first that we meet is Frau Grubach. She is the landlady. of the place where Joseph lives. We also have Fräulein Bürstner, who is a person who lives also in this place, so I guess you would call her his neighbor. She has a friend named Fräulein Montag, who appears at the beginning of the novel. And then there's a really, interesting cast of characters. We have an uncle of Kay who comes to visit him at one point. He meets a student also, he meets a lawyer. There's a painter named Titorelli. There's a girl named Lenny, an Italian character who arrives as a visitor or a tourist towards the end of the novel. There's a priest also. So you can see lots of people from very different walks of life with whom Joseph interacts to different degrees. And I really liked also the situations, the scenes that the novel presents. So I'm going to mention maybe 3 of them that stood out and kind of stuck with me. And I think the most important one to me was the first interrogation that Joseph undergoes. This happens in a really large room at the court, and it's packed with people, so you can think of this as everybody's worst nightmare, just being exposed there in front of all of these strangers. And there's also at one point in a corner a man and a woman in a rather compromising position right there. Very, very interesting and kind of surreal moment. We also have a scene right there, and I was thinking, this is also one of the scenes that stood out to me. There's a point at which Joseph opens a door and he finds there a man who is about to whip 2 of his warders. So very strange. He kind of runs into them and starts talking to them, trying to save these people from that horrible situation. But very difficult task for him right there. And then I really liked towards the very end his visit to the cathedral. He goes there with this Italian tourist who wants to see the places of this town where they live, and he has a conversation there with a priest. So very interesting scene to me. Those 3 I think were the ones that stood out. The settings, I found them to be just haunting and at the same time attractive. It's that kind of thing that gives you fear, but at the same time the attraction of that fear. At first, in terms of settings, we have 2 places. The first one that we encounter is the house, and then we also have the bank. So once the warders enter his house and tell him you're under arrest, then Joseph doesn't really feel comfortable at his house. But the bank then emerges as the place where logic reigns. This is a place where he is by himself with his co-workers. Nobody is watching him. He is not really under surveillance there. So it becomes that safe place for him. Then you also have the court, for example, and you would assume that this is a place where order would be important and logic and all that stuff, but it's really not. Okay, it's a very strange place. It is a grotesque place. At one point, Kay opens one of the law books there, and you think, a law book is something that is so rigid, so solid, that has weight to it, and he opens it and he finds dirty pictures inside. So you see what I'm saying? It's just everything seems to be out of place. That whole atmosphere of a nightmare that we get when we read the work of Franz Kafka. And my favorite setting, as you may expect from what I told you before about the different scenes that I like, is the cathedral. Okay, and this is where Kay has that conversation with a priest. The priest tells him the parable titled Before the Law. You may have read it separately as a different story if you have like the collected stories of Franz Kafka, so it's included there. And the priest then proceeds to analyze the story, and tell him different perspectives that you can look at this story, this parable really, and see how it may apply to the case and to the life of Joseph Kay. I think with Kafka, one of the things that we have to consider is that it's very difficult, almost impossible for us at this point in history not to read Kafka in an allegorical mode. Okay, so obviously many people have pointed out that the trial prophesies the arrests carried out by totalitarian governments, especially in the 20th century. So obviously you may think of the Nazi extermination camps, you may think of the Gulag, the arrests in Latin America, right? The tortures, the disappearances of people in Africa too. Personally, I read the trial, and of course I think of 1970s Argentina, even though I had not been born then, but I grew up listening to horrible stories about this, and it's kind of something that I absorbed. So that's what I think about in terms of allegory. But as you know, allegory doesn't necessarily have to be historical, right? And I think Kay's predicament is that of every human being. There's that moment that comes in our lives when we become aware of the burden of existence. And this can be manifested also as a form of guilt. For Kay, there's that before and after. Before and after the moment when he was told that he was considered to be guilty of something, he doesn't really know what, and he cannot ignore that fact. It's just as you might say, that all of us, each one of us, is accountable for his or her actions in a transcendent or in a non-transcendent way. This is something that many religious or faith systems, Christianity to give an example, and existentialism agree on. We should all be accountable for our actions and also for our lack of action in many cases. So you can see that the allegory is definitely there. You can of course read this also in a literal level, and it works. The allegory is there, but it is much more complex than it might seem at first. I want to talk about 3 moods, okay, that I experienced while reading this text. And the first one is, of course, very obviously, anxiety. I mean, imagine being accused of something that you did not do or that you are not aware of having done, because that is what is at play here. Let me give you a quick example, just a personal anecdote, that kind of illustrates the kind of anxiety that is at play here. This happened to me when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I was at the playground during one of the breaks that we had in school. And then I was just there, just standing and just minding my own business. And all of a sudden I see the teacher coming towards me with holding this little kid by the hand. And the little kid was just crying his eyes out and pointing at me. I was like, what did I do? I didn't do anything. And the teacher asked me, were you running? Because this kid says that you were running and you hit him and he fell down. I was like, I was not running. And then I started thinking, well, what if I was running? And I thought, okay, well, at one point I was kind of jogging, okay, and didn't I feel like I had touched something with my arm very lightly? I was convinced at first that I hadn't done anything, but then I started thinking about it and I was like, well, yeah, I was kind of jogging and I did feel something. The teacher was like, do not run, you know the rules, etc., etc. So I went back into the classroom, after the break, heartbroken, because I was like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And there's this other kid, a classmate of mine, who looked very similar to me. I had like a little doppelganger when I was 9 or 10. So that's one of the reasons why I am attracted to those kinds of stories. And he was like, oh, I saw everything. I saw you get blamed for this. It was me. And I was like, oh my gosh, and you let me get in trouble? He said something like, well, if you had gotten into real trouble, I would have said something. And I was like, yeah, I'm sure. But you see what I'm saying, right? This idea that it was clarified, the whole thing. And at the end of the day, I knew that I hadn't done anything. But for that moment, I felt that anxiety of being accused and also of not even knowing if I had been guilty or not. In this case, I was not. So that was a good thing. The next one, helplessness, okay? Kay tries to understand. He talks to many characters. He's trying to figure out what happened, what it is that he did wrong. But this idea, the issue that he's trying to clarify becomes more and more muddled as the story progresses, just as the castle becomes farther and farther away, it seems, as that other novel progresses. So that's the kind of helplessness that is common to Kafka. You can see it in the trial, and you can see it also in the castle. The third one, okay, the last mood that I experienced here was that sense of the grotesque. And let me tell you, this is not emphasized a lot. You're going to see it, many critics talk about it, but not that much. It seems that other issues take precedence over this. There's a kind of eroticism to the trial, especially towards the beginning of the novel, but it is very grotesque, okay? And the whole novel, actually, beyond the eroticism, is pervaded by that nightmarish atmosphere that you find in the works of Kafka. It's really the trial like a vision of hell, okay? And of course, there are critics who speak of the castle as the novel that represents the divine realm, right? Like heaven, if you will. Then we have Amerika, right? So Amerika, a geographic location, like a tangible place, unlike the setting of other novels and other stories by Kafka. Amerika, the one that would represent the earth, right? And then finally, of course, the trial as a representation of hell. So the underworld and all that. I think it's interesting to look at it that way. You know, it's a little bit reductive, if you will, but I think there's definitely something, there's a case that you can make there regarding that interpretation of the three novels. And I like it, you know, it's neat in that way. You know how I usually share some criticism with you sometimes when I feel like it, when I have time, etc., etc. Today what I wanted to do is I wanted to explore very briefly what Albert Camus has said about the trial. I read lots of criticism here. I read from Beatriz Sarlo, you know, the Argentine critic. I also read Walter Benjamin, his text on that. But the ones that I stayed with are, you know, the words and the ideas of Albert Camus as he expressed them in the myth of Sisyphus. So towards the end, you know, there's an appendix to that famous essay. And the appendix is titled Hope and the Absurd in the Work of Franz Kafka. So this is where I'm getting those ideas, in particular about the trial. You know, we want to focus on that. The first one has to do with the meaning of the novel. And this is what Camus says. People have spoken of an image of the human condition when talking about the trial. To be sure, yet it is both simpler and more complex. I mean that the significance of the novel is more particular and more personal to Kafka. To a certain degree, he is the one who does the talking, even though it is me, he confesses. He lives and he is condemned. He learns this on the first pages of the novel he is pursuing in this world, and if he tries to cope with this, he nonetheless does so without surprise. He will never show sufficient astonishment at his lack of astonishment. It is by such contradictions that the first signs of the absurd work are recognized. So when I read that, I was thinking of T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. You know how T.S. Eliot said that The Wasteland was actually a personal statement. And of course, you know, he is exaggerating. He's maybe simplifying it. We can expect that. But that other people, you know, people had read it and made it into some kind of a testament for a whole generation. And of course, you know, when I would say, how can I put this? When the author's soul is big enough to encompass more than him or herself, you can do something like that. And I think Kafka is definitely one of those cases. I think Eliot is too. That may be debatable according to your perspective, but Kafka definitely. Now, is there a key to the work of Kafka? And if there is, which one, what is your interpretation of that? According to Camus, the key to Kafka is a certain ambiguity. That's the way that he puts it, a fundamental ambiguity. That's what he says. And here on page 126, he says, these perpetual oscillations between the natural and the extraordinary, the individual and the universal, the tragic and the everyday, the absurd and the logical, are found throughout his work and give it both its resonance and its meaning. These are the paradoxes that must be enumerated, the contradictions that must be strengthened in order to understand the absurd work. And then finally, something that Camus points out that I thought was very interesting and enlightening to me also, is that the trial and the castle are complementary. They complement each other. And this is what he says right here, page 130. The trial propounds a problem which the castle, to a certain degree, solves. The first describes according to a quasi-scientific method and without concluding. The second, to a certain degree, explains. The trial diagnoses. The castle imagines a treatment. But the remedy proposed here does not cure. It merely brings the malady back into normal life. It helps to accept it. In a certain sense, let us think of Kierkegaard, it makes people cherish it. So I think that is also very enlightening to me, you know, when I think of what's the connection here between the trial and the castle, because it's, you know, the work of Kafka, you kind of have to read it in that context. Everything should be read in the context of the author's work. But in this case, they are so tightly related as to be sister novels, The Trial and The Castle. Amerika is a different story. It's definitely there, you know, definitely important. But these two, they are so close together that we need some kind of interpretation, you know, as to what is the connection, what is the meaning, what does one add to the other, how do they speak to each other. And I think Camus has a very good point right there. So some thoughts about the film adaptation, and I'm talking, of course, about the one by Orson Welles from 1962, starring, of course, Anthony Perkins a couple of years after his performance as Norman Bates. Wonderful stuff. It also stars Jean Moreau, Romy Schneider, Michael Lonsdale is also there as the priest in a very diminished role, really, because the priest in the film does not have a lot of words, really, and does not have a very important role there. That whole story with, the parable before the law, the interpretation, in the film, that was given to the character played by Orson Welles, the advocate, not to the priest. So there's a little bit of a difference right there. The film was shot in Croatia, Italy, and France. And the first thing that stood out to me, the first word that comes to my mind when I was watching the film and also right now is expressionism. Okay, this is the driving principle right here. You can see it in the settings, in the camera angles. For example, in the house, the first place that we see, one thing that grabbed my attention was how low the ceilings were. Like unrealistic, not realism at all here in this film. You have very low ceilings. The camera angles are low also at points, making everything distorted and disorienting in many of the scenes. Then when you get to the bank, I really liked it because you see these endless rows of people working, these desks. So it made me think of The Apartment, that part where you see that perspective and all the people working. But this is even more interesting, I would say, and even worse, quote unquote, the way that it is presented. And the court, okay, that the court as a setting is so eerie. Okay, not only the place but also outside. There's this sculpture, and you see people with numbers hanging from their necks. Just very, very, very good job in capturing that nightmarish atmosphere of the work of Kafka. And here's something interesting. Orson Welles said in discussion that Kay was guilty, as a matter of fact. So we could ask ourselves, guilty of what, right? Of course, there are many ways that we could answer that question, but I think we could say that Kay is guilty of logic. Kay is guilty of reason in an absurd world, right? Couldn't we interpret it as that? I think that's a possibility. We also know from Peter Bogdanovich that while Orson Welles watched this film, he was laughing. And I think that is really interesting to know because it's something that also happened when Kafka was reading his own work to his friends and acquaintances. He would laugh, people say. And we think, at this point, like reading Kafka right now, from our perspective, 21st century, knowing what we know, and in many cases having seen what we saw during the 20th century, it is just very difficult for us to read Kafka and to laugh. Okay, I think I don't remember laughing when I was reading Kafka. I have laughed at works that were or have been influenced by the Kafka approach, but not when I read The Trial, for example, because this is just too dark for me to laugh. It's too nightmarish. It's too anxiety-inducing and all that. But really, if we go to the heart of it, there is really a humor here. It's an absurd humor. It's a dark humor. It's, the Kafkaesque type of humor, which is so difficult to capture. And the film by Orson Welles does a very good job at capturing it. So that's why I think it's so successful. Now, the ending has been changed. Slightly, just the very, very ending has been changed. But there is a very important change right there. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but if you have seen it or if you do decide to watch it, please let me know what you think about this ending and the decision to change it like that. And also this, do you think that this ending gives the character of Kay more agency than the original ending in the novel? That's my question to you. Bottom line, it's a sort of cliche to speak of Proust, Joyce, and Kafka as a kind of a holy trinity of literature in the 20th century, but that doesn't really make it any less true, if you ask me. The Trial may not be Kafka's masterpiece. I think that title goes to The Castle, even though it was Amerika that Jorge Luis Borges decided to include in his Biblioteca Personal, the best books that he had ever read. But I think that The Trial is Kafka's most popular of the three novels because it is the most accessible. And I would also even say that it is the most obvious in many cases. And of course, that word is a little bit complex and there's a lot that goes into it, but I'll let you interpret that for yourself. The Trial works wonderfully, both at the literal level and at the allegorical level. And then genre-wise, I would think that, in my opinion, I would say that The Trial is really a novel-length novella. But that's another story. Don't get me started on the novella and all that good stuff. Without a doubt, this is one of the cornerstones of 20th century literature. So if you have not read it, You have no idea how much I envy you, but I would say just please find a copy as soon as you can, read it, and please come back and let me know what you think about it. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on the Prozess, the trial by Franz Kafka. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.